Hello, welcome back to my channel. I am Drago the Greedy. That is not my real name, but you probably already knew that. And welcome back to yet another video. This video is more of a follow-up video on my previous video, which I did on swords and blunt force and whatnot. And I thought I would try to explain some things further and to, correct me myself a bit in the previous video. Not that I disagree with anything I said, but I made some implications that I didn't actually believe, that were unintentional, and so I will try to, with this video, clear those things up. So with that out of the way, we're just gonna get started, and I still have no intro. So what I said in my previous video, to sum it up short, were that blunt weapons are a lot less effective than people usually realize against plate, and therefore swords are reasonable weapons to use against a man in full armor. I still stand by that statement. However, I do realize I made it sound like blunt force is absolutely useless against armor, which it definitely is not. Blunt force definitely has its place in beating armor. And aside from the use I mentioned in the previous video, which is horseback use, which I will which I will explain a bit in greater detail right about now, there's also a few other areas in which blunt force is utilized and is quite good at dealing with a man in armor. So I will try to explain those things a bit further, starting with what you would do on horseback and why blunt weapons are good weapons on horseback. So the thing, as I said, with horseback is that, well, you're on a horse. What this does is that you can get a lot more momentum swinging a blunt weapons around. With a horse galloping at full speed, you can multiply your force delivered by several times. This is extremely dangerous, especially considering that the target you're aiming at is the head, which is perfectly in height for you to just reach down with your hammer and bash people in the head. Bashing people in the head, galloping around at full force with a horse, very good thing to do. Their blunt weapons are useful. Of course, they aren't still very prevalent there, and I explained this a bit in my previous video. It is because that rarely happens. When it happens, it's great, but it's not what usually happens. Usually you're charging at other cavalry with lances, or you're charging at infantry with lances because you have your lances. And when you get into melee, you're usually not charging anymore, so you just draw your swords because you can use them more versatilely. But of course, carrying a blunt weapon on horseback as a backup weapon to your lance, which is a very deadly weapon, is very much an alternative and has been done not just in the form of maces or hammers, but also in axes in the previous eras. So with that being said, what are the uses of blunt force on foot especially? Well, the thing is that blunt force, contrary to what I made it sound before, is not entirely useless against a man in armor. You can deal damage through the armor with blunt force. Of course, more depending on what type of armor he's wearing. You're gonna deal more damage with blunt force through mail than you're gonna do through plate. But even so, if you hit a guy enough times in the head, even if he's wearing a very, very protective helmet, sooner or later he's gonna feel it. Alright, and this is utilized in formations, for example, where you don't always have the option to go for all of those fancy maneuvers that you would be able to do in a more open scenario. Therefore, you do see pole arms, which are very concussive oriented use in such formations, such as huge axes, or if we go late 14th century France, you see big hammers mounted on poles, which aren't pole axes, but actual pole hammers, or what I'd call pole hammers. And these are a good enough formation because you can bash the people in the head. The people that are standing in front of you can just bash them in the head a few times, and sooner or later they're gonna fall. As I said, if you do not have the space, if you do not have the required um, movement to be able to do all of those fancy maneuvers which will let you go get through his armor, you can use blunt force. This does not apply to sidearms as much, simply because once you're well in sidearm range, you're better off grappling with him, and grappling with an opponent is you can exploit grappling more with a sword than you can do with a blunt force weapon. The blunt force primary weapons are definitely used, and they're also a lot more deadly, as I mentioned in the previous video, because of the amount of force you can deliver with them, which is several times higher than that, or which you can deliver with a one-handed short weapon. There are accounts of this being used. For example, Scottish knights, Lowlander knights were armored, and there are accounts of billmen saying how many that it took a lot of hits to bring them down, which implies that in an actual formation you would still see bashing people in the head with long pointy polearms, or not pointy but long, quite tip heavy polearms used. It works, all right. It doesn't work as well as stabbing you in the face, but that is not always an option. And while you can have the possibility to generate that option, sometimes you don't get it. And so there, blunt force can be utilized against people in full armor. Another place where blunt force is quite utilized is in the sort of distracting way. Okay, you see it a lot in fencing manuals, whether it be Poleaxe fencing manual or longsword fencing manual. You do see the use of blunt force to disorient, stun, make it, or just create an opening for you to follow up on. And this is quite straightforward, really. You hit a guy in the head, and even if he's not gonna feel it, or even if he's not gonna get substantial damage out of it, he's still gonna twitch, he's gonna get disoriented, he's gonna react some way, and most often the way he reacts instinctively, reflexively, gives you an opening to follow up on. Therefore, you do see weapons such as poleaxes do have a blunt end. It's because you open up with the blunt end, for example a chop to his head, and then from there on you follow up with a thrust or a throw to the ground. Thrusts generally, you do see these kind of techniques used. The same goes for the famous mordhowl or murder stroke that you see used with long swords and sometimes other swords as well. Is you hit him in the head and you use the momentary opening there you have created there to follow up with a more deadly attack. This is also tying in a bit to my previous point that simply blunt force weapons with no other offensive capabilities than blunt force cannot follow up on these attacks as well as other weapons can. A sword, you can hit him in the head with the hilt and then you can quickly follow up with a stab or something like that. With a purely blunt force weapon, all you can follow up with is more blunt force. And it works. I'm not gonna say it doesn't work. It just doesn't work as well as following you up with a more deadly attack. So what I'm basically saying is here that blunt force definitely has its place. If we disregard place entirely, if we look at, for example, a man wearing mail, you can deliver more blunt force through mail than you can through plate. And even though he will be wearing some sort of padding underneath, usually a lot less than many people think, but that's a topic for another video which I'm planning to make in the future. It does, however, need a bit more research at the moment, so I'm holding off with that for now. Well, with that being said, even with padding on underneath, it stops the damage from being dealt, but it doesn't necessarily stop you from feeling the hit. And when you feel the hit, you're gonna react. So, for example, if I have a sword and meeting a man in mail, I may choose to hit him, for example, in the liver with my full force, with my hilt. which was something that came up when I was discussing this idea with a few acquaintances. Mentioned how you could, for example, take a sword which the hilt hit him in the liver, which is gonna hurt a whole lot. It's not gonna damage him, but it will create an opening for you to follow up on, as stated previously. Which is why, again, it ties back to my previous point that swords usually can do the blunt force part as well, and then move on to do the part that purely blunt force part weapons can't do. You get what I'm trying to say. I need a break. So to summarize whatever I've said in this video up, is that the blunt force is definitely not useless against a man in armor. It definitely has its place in fighting someone in armor. It is why, of course, weapons do have blunt force capabilities and why you see blunt techniques used with weapons. However, it is great to have a weapon which can create an opening with blunt force and then following up that opening with something that isn't blunt force but is a lot more deadly than it is to simply have a weapon that the only follow-up you can have with a blunt force weapon is blunt force. So you're gonna take a lot more to kill him. So it's not necessarily that blunt force weapons are a lot worse at dealing with people in armor. They can be comparable. The thing is that weapons that are not purely blunt force are as good as blunt force weapons at dealing with armor and better in almost every other context. It's a matter of priorities, really. Are you going to carry a blunt force weapon which will do about as good against a man in plate as a sword will, maybe even marginally worse? Or are you going to carry a sword which will do well against a man in armor because it can deal blunt force, it can follow up on openings, it can do many things, and can also deal with unarmored opponents a lot easier by just cutting them into pieces? Yeah, I think that is why we also see swords a lot more. It's because they serve good use in armor and they serve good use outside of armored context as well, something blunt force weapons don't do as much. With that out of the way, I think this concludes this video. I hope I did not imply something I will come to regret in the future, though knowing me, that is certainly very possible that I did. That being said, as I said, I am thinking of making an armor on padding worn with armor, which is also a topic I think is quite misrepresented. Quite widespread myths exist about it. That being said, I need to research the topic a bit more myself, consult with other people I know, try to discuss it, read some conclusions. Once I've done that, I will probably be making that video as well. That being said, thank you for watching. Once again, if you disagree, leave your points in the comments and I will try to hold a civil debate about it. Keyword being try. See you all later.